I have studied enough strategic failures to recognize when a government achieves the exact opposite of its stated objective. History is filled with these ironies. Policies designed to demonstrate strength that reveal weakness. Actions intended to secure dominance that accelerate its loss. Military campaigns meant to establish control that guarantee resistance. This pattern appears so consistently across civilizations that you would think strategists would learn to anticipate it. They never do. What happened between February 2025 and the present represents one of the most complete inversions of strategic intent I have observed in modern international relations. The Trump administration imposed tariffs on Canada with the explicit goal of extracting concessions and reinforcing American economic dominance over its northern neighbor. What those tariffs actually produced was the one outcome American strategists had spent 80 years trying to prevent. A truly independent Canada with the infrastructure, relationships, and most critically, the psychological orientation to function without American approval. I want to emphasize what independence actually means in this context because the word gets used carelessly. Independence does not mean isolation. It does not mean hostility. It does not mean the absence of economic relationships. Independence means having alternatives. It means possessing the capability to walk away from any single relationship without catastrophic consequences. It means that your strategic choices are determined by your own assessment of your interests, rather than by fear of what a more powerful neighbor might do if you displease them. Canada had not possessed this kind of independence since before World War II. The post-war economic integration between Canada and the United States had been constructed deliberately to make Canadian independence impossible. Trade relationships were structured so that Canada exported raw materials south and imported finished goods at premium prices. Financial systems were integrated so that Canadian monetary policy could not diverge significantly from American preferences without triggering capital flight. Defense arrangements ensured that Canadian security depended on American protection. This was not an accident. This was designed subordination disguised as partnership. American strategists understood, even if they rarely stated it explicitly, that an independent Canada represented a fundamental threat to American power in North America. Not a military threat, obviously, but something potentially more significant. A demonstration that a developed, resource-rich nation sharing a border with the United States could chart its own course, build its own relationships, and prosper without accepting American dominance. If Canada could do this successfully, other countries might conclude that American power was less permanent than it appeared. This was the nightmare scenario that American policy had been designed to prevent for 3 generations. The tariff strategy announced in early 2025 was supposed to reinforce this subordination. 25% on lumber, steel, and agricultural products, 15% on energy, but the critical psychological error, the miscalculation that revealed how profoundly the Trump administration misunderstood its own strategic position, was the invocation of Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. This provision allows the United States to impose tariffs on imports classified as threats to national security. Think carefully about what this classification communicates. You are telling your largest trading partner, your military ally in every significant conflict since 1917, the nation with which you share a border that has been undefended for over 2 centuries, that their aluminum and steel production represents a danger to your survival. You are using language reserved for adversaries to describe your closest neighbor. The intended message was dominance and control. The received message was that the relationship had become hostile and that continued dependence on American markets represented a strategic vulnerability. The immediate Canadian response was the $4.2 billion boycott. 68% of Canadians independently deciding to avoid American goods and services. Travel to the United States, collapsing by 37% in a single month. Cross-border shopping, a ritual for millions of families, simply stopping. American border communities watching their economic foundations disintegrate. But this boycott was not the strategic transformation. This boycott was the symptom that revealed the transformation was already occurring psychologically. When Justin Trudeau resigned in early 2025 and Canada appointed Mark Carney as Prime Minister, American strategists should have recognized they had created a crisis. Carney is not a conventional politician. He's a central banker who understands leverage, financial architecture, and strategic positioning at a level that simply does not exist in contemporary American leadership. More importantly, Carney had watched the 2008 financial crisis, the first Trump administration, and the pandemic progressively erode Canadian faith in American economic management. He understood that the tariffs were not an isolated policy mistake, but the culmination of a pattern that made continued dependence unacceptable. His response was the $1.2 trillion sovereignty investment program. This was not rhetorical positioning. This was systematic construction of the infrastructure necessary for genuine independence. $340 billion to build east-west trade corridors bypassing American markets. $280 billion for critical minerals processing domestically. But the component that revealed Carney understood he was not adjusting policy, but transforming Canada's strategic position permanently was the $180 billion commitment to the Arctic Gateway Initiative centered on Churchill Port. Churchill had been economically irrelevant for decades, a remote northern port with seasonal ice that made commercial shipping impractical. But Carney recognized that climate change was opening Arctic shipping routes, and Churchill was the only deepwater Arctic port in North America, with direct rail connection to continental markets. A cargo ship traveling from Hamburg to Winnipeg saves 6,400 kilometers using Churchill rather than traditional routes, 12 days of transit time, $620,000 in fuel costs per voyage. This was not minor optimization. This was revolutionary competitive advantage. This is what genuine independence looks like. Not isolation or hostility, but the quiet confidence that comes from having alternatives. Canada could maintain economic relationships with the United States, but those relationships would now occur between peers rather than between hegemon and subordinate. American pressure that once would have guaranteed Canadian compliance now triggered Canadian resistance. American threats that once would have produced concessions now accelerated Canadian diversification. I have observed this pattern in other historical contexts. Imperial powers always underestimate how quickly subordinate nations can build independence once they commit to it. The British in 1776 assumed American colonists could not function economically without British markets and British protection. They were wrong. The Soviet Union in 1989 assumed Eastern European nations could not maintain modern economies without Soviet integration. They were wrong. Dominant powers consistently misjudge how much of their control depends not on structural necessity, but on subordinate nations choosing not to pursue alternatives. The Trump tariffs eliminated that choice. They made continued subordination psychologically unacceptable to Canadian citizens and strategically unacceptable to Canadian leadership. And once you classify your neighbor's industrial production as a national security threat, once you weaponize trade relationships for domestic political purposes, once you demonstrate that the relationship can be disrupted arbitrarily for reasons having nothing to do with the subordinate nation's behavior, you force that nation to conclude that dependence equals vulnerability rather than security. American strategists had spent 80 years preventing exactly this conclusion. They understood that an independent Canada represented not primarily an economic threat, but a psychological one, a demonstration that American dominance was a choice rather than a necessity, that middle powers with the right resources and the right strategy could chart independent courses, that proximity to the United States did not require subordination to the United States. This was the nightmare scenario, and Trump's tariffs made it reality. The irony would be amusing if the consequences were not so significant. A policy designed to demonstrate American strength and extract Canadian concessions instead revealed American weakness and triggered Canadian independence. The harder Washington pushed, the faster Canada built alternatives. The more threats Washington issued, the more relationships Canada forged with other powers. Every action intended to reinforce dominance accelerated its erosion. This is not the end of the Canadian-American relationship. Geography and culture and economic integration ensure continued connection. But it is the end of subordination. It is the end of the assumption that Canadian policy would align with American preferences because Canada had no alternative. It is the end of 80 years of American veto power over Canadian strategic choices. The structure that emerged from World War II and persisted through the Cold War and beyond has been permanently altered. What Trump's tariffs created was not a hostile neighbor, but an independent one. And independent neighbors, by definition, make their own choices about their own interests, using their own judgment. Sometimes those choices align with American preferences. Sometimes they do not. But the choice itself is no longer subject to American approval. This is what genuine independence means. This is what American policy had been designed to prevent. This is what Trump's tariffs inadvertently created. The transformation is irreversible. The infrastructure exists. The relationships exist. The alternatives exist. Most importantly, the psychological shift exists. Canadians have internalized that they do not need American approval to prosper. That recognition, once it occurs at the population level, cannot be reversed through diplomatic negotiation or policy adjustment. The subordinate relationship depended on Canadians believing they had no alternative. They now know they do. That knowledge changes everything. History will record the Trump tariffs as the policy that achieved precisely the opposite of its intended effect. Designed to reinforce American dominance, they created Canadian independence. Intended to extract concessions, they triggered diversification. Meant to demonstrate strength, they revealed that American power over Canada had always depended more on Canadian acceptance than American capability. Once that acceptance ended, the dominance ended with it. This is how strategic relationships fundamentally change. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through the accumulation of alternatives and the psychological shift that occurs when subordinate parties realize that continued subordination is a choice rather than a necessity. The moment they make a different choice, the relationship transforms. And once transformed, it cannot return to its previous form simply because the policy that triggered the transformation is reversed. What America feared most was an independent Canada. What Trump's tariffs created was exactly that. The policy succeeded in demonstrating something, but not what its architects intended. It demonstrated that American dominance over Canada was more fragile than anyone had recognized. That fragility, once exposed, cannot be concealed again. The relationship has permanently changed. What comes next will be determined by how well both nations adapt to the new reality. But the old reality, where American preferences determined Canadian policy, is finished. By the time most people understand what occurred, it will no longer matter. The alternatives will be institutionalized. The relationships will be established. The infrastructure will be operational. The psychological shift will be complete. History does not offer do-overs for strategic failures this comprehensive. It only records that the policy intended to prevent Canadian independence became the mechanism that created it. The irony is perfect. The consequences are permanent. By September 2025, when the first post-Panamax container ship docked at Churchill loaded with Canadian wheat bound for Germany, the message was unmistakable. North American trade no longer required American infrastructure or American approval. Canadian grain could reach European markets without passing through American ports, American transportation systems, or American financial clearing mechanisms. The market understood immediately. Canadian wheat futures jumped 23%. Potash prices spiked 31% as buyers recognized they could source directly from Canada without American intermediation. But infrastructure alone does not create independence. Independence requires alternatives. While Trump was systematically alienating America's traditional allies through unpredictable policy and rhetorical hostility, Carney was building a coalition of nations seeking alternatives to American economic dominance. Comprehensive trade agreements with the European Union worth $244 billion integrated Canadian companies into European defense supply chains. This was Canada signaling that if American commitment to NATO continued eroding, alternative security relationships existed. Bilateral deals with Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand specifically targeted the 700 million person ASEAN market. The message was clear. Canadian resources could reach Asian markets without American permission. Even the relationship with China, strained for years over diplomatic disputes, was recalibrated. Without compromising fundamental values, Canada positioned itself as a pragmatic middle power willing to maintain economic relationships with all major powers while serving as strategic proxy for none. The results by late 2025 documented the transformation. Canadian exports to Europe up 34%, exports to Asia up 28%, American agricultural exports declining as international buyers found alternatives. But the most significant indicator was private equity flows. Foreign direct investment in Canadian infrastructure jumped 340%. Global capital was making a judgment about future power distribution in North America. That judgment favored Canada. I want to pause here and emphasize the strategic logic that American policymakers completely failed to anticipate. For 80 years, American dominance over Canada functioned because Canada had no alternatives. No alternative markets of comparable size, no alternative supply chains, no alternative infrastructure for reaching global customers. American strategists assumed this situation was permanent. Geographic proximity guaranteed dependence. Shared borders guaranteed alignment. This assumption was so deeply embedded that no one seriously questioned it. But the assumption contained a fatal vulnerability. It was only true as long as alternatives did not exist. The moment Canada possessed alternative markets, alternative infrastructure, and alternative relationships, the entire logic collapsed. Geography determines possibilities, but not necessities. Proximity creates opportunities, but not dependencies. Canada shares a border with the United States, but also possesses access to Atlantic, Pacific, and increasingly Arctic shipping routes. As global trade patterns shift toward Asia and Europe, oceanic connections become more valuable than land borders. The Trump tariffs forced Canada to build these alternatives, not gradually over decades through natural economic evolution, but rapidly through focused strategic investment. The tariffs provided both the political justification domestically and the urgent necessity strategically. Carney could tell Canadians that sovereignty required short-term economic cost, and they accepted it because Trump had made continued dependence feel more risky than independence. This was the catastrophic American miscalculation. They gave Canada both motive and time to build comprehensive alternatives. By the time the USMCA review date approached in mid-2026, the balance of negotiating power had completely inverted. Trump had assumed 18 months of tariffs would bring Canada desperate for any deal. Instead, Canada approached negotiations with signed trade agreements with Europe and Asia, functioning Arctic shipping infrastructure, and declining dependence on American markets. Mark Carney could credibly state that Canada preferred free trade and partnership, but no longer needed subordination. American negotiators had no effective response. The December 2025 U.S. Trade Representative hearings documented the collapse of the American position. Over 3 days, 147 American business leaders testified, begging the administration not to destroy relationships their survival depended on. Ford cited $1.4 billion in losses from supply chain disruptions. GM closed 2 Michigan plants specifically due to Canadian component costs. The American Trucking Association called the policy economically suicidal. When your own corporate sector is publicly contradicting your trade strategy, you have lost control of the narrative. But the deeper transformation was psychological. Canadian citizens had internalized that separation from the United States was not only possible, but potentially preferable. The 68% who participated in the boycott had discovered that avoiding American products did not significantly reduce their quality of life. Canadian businesses had learned that European and Asian customers paid fairly and honored contracts. Canadian policymakers had experienced that American approval was not necessary for international legitimacy. Once populations internalize these lessons, they do not unlearn them because political leadership changes.